Hello, I'm Robin and welcome to Bookspin. So, I thought I'd try doing something a little interesting today. I'd like to talk about my top 10 science fiction short stories that I've read. So these are stories that I got a lot of pleasure out of reading, and they're particularly memorable to me for whatever reason. They could be beautifully written, or they contain fascinating ideas, they're thought-provoking, or they're just gripping tales. So this is my list of some of my favourites. It's not an authoritative list because I'm not an expert at all in this area, but these are some stories that I really enjoyed. And as with previous lists that I've made in the past, I'm going for a maximum of one entry per author in order to keep things diverse. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. So the first story that I'd like to mention is called Grafenwalder's Bestiary by Alastair Reynolds. And this one you can find in this book, Galactic North, which is a collection of stories set within the Revelation space universe. So it might help if you've already read some of the other Revelation space books first, like Chasm City and Diamond Dogs, as these add a bit of context to this story, but you can still totally enjoy it as a standalone story. And this is really quite a dark tale with some definite sci-fi horror elements. Grafenwalder is a very sinister protagonist who owns his own private bestiary of rare and exotic animals and freak bioengineering creations. His mission in this story is to hunt down the ultimate specimen to add to his collection, a fabled creature known as the Denizen, which is an artificially engineered sentient aquatic species, supposed to have been created long ago on Europa. This becomes an obsession of his to find the last of its kind, and he will stop at nothing to achieve this goal. But meanwhile, he is threatened by a charismatic rival collector named Ursula Goodglass, who is an equally morally questionable character. So I love the dark atmosphere in this story, the character dynamics, and the use of a thoroughly unsympathetic protagonist. There's also a fantastic twist that makes this story all the more satisfying to read. And among all of the Reynolds short stories that I've read, this is probably my favourite. Next up, Footvote by Peter F. Hamilton. I recently discovered this story. I read Hamilton's collection, Manhattan in Reverse, earlier this summer. So there might be a bit of recency bias going on here, but I really enjoyed this collection and I felt compelled to include it in this list. The short stories and novellas within this book are a great showcase for this author and his fascinating world building and his futuristic technological visions. And Footvote is one story that stood out for me in particular from this book. It's set in a present-day Britain fraught with acute social problems. And this story presents an alternate history within this world in which a visionary politician manages to open up a wormhole to another planet where he starts building a colony which he calls New Suffolk, right? So this is a utopian project of sorts. And he's inviting British people to emigrate there and build his new society with the promise of a new and better life. However, he imposes strict criteria on the sort of people who are allowed in, with a constitution of rules that they have to agree to. But this story is not so much about the new colony that he's creating as the chaos and the social unrest he's leaving behind, and actually actively fomenting by encouraging people to abandon their society and leave the mess behind for others to deal with back on Earth. So it's quite a contentious issue, this wormhole, and it creates a very volatile situation. And in this story, we take an intimate look at this from the point of view of a divorced couple and their children caught up in this whole drama. And they have diverging views on the wormhole. And there are some very tough decisions that they're going to have to make in this story. I think it works really well as a short story. There's some great narrative tension and a fascinating moral dilemma. And there are also some nice humorous touches to boot. Next, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a classic piece of philosophical science fiction and one of the first Le Guin stories that I read. I recently reread it as part of this collection, The Wind's 12 Quarters. It's pretty short, only 9 pages long. It's more of a thought experiment than a proper story, but like a lot of Le Guin's work, it's a very thought-provoking and memorable piece of fiction. So the name in the title refers to a utopian city-state called Omelas, which is a serene and prosperous paradise where everyone is perfectly happy and perfectly fulfilled. So it's an absolutely wonderful place to live. But in order to confirm your place as a citizen within the society, you must first learn of a devastating secret that this utopia is contingent upon and accept this. Is this really such a perfect utopia? Or is it just a facade for something that is actually very dark and disturbing? So this is a quick read, but it's very haunting and compelling, and it definitely leaves a strong impression on the reader. It's very beautifully written, and it's got a kind of fable-like quality to it. So I think this is a great entry point for getting a taster of Le Guin's writing. The next story I'd like to mention is The 9 Billion Names of God by Arthur C. Clarke. This is an absolute classic. It's one that you often find in lists of best sci-fi short stories ever, and with good justification, I think. I first came across this story years ago, before I'd read anything else by Clarke, but I recently reread it in this anthology that I picked up called Other Worlds, Other Gods. I'm sure there are plenty of other places where you can find it, though. It's only a few pages long, but it's got some deep themes and a very memorable ending line that really packs a punch. So in this tale, we have a state-of-the-art machine that gets commissioned by a Tibetan monastery to facilitate an age-old mystical mission. The machine is programmed to calculate every single name that God has ever been known by, which is predicted to be 9 billion names. So this is a really huge calculation. And this is a story about religion and about computers, but there's a lot more to it than that. What's going to happen when the computer finally completes its calculation and all the names are printed out? You should give it a read and find out for yourself, if you haven't already done so. For such a short piece, this is a very evocative and unforgettable piece of fiction, and it definitely deserves a place among the classics. Next up, The Last Save by Guin. This is a neat and thought-provoking time travel story, and you can find it in this book, Synopticon, which is a Chinese SF anthology. I think that time travel as a subgenre has a lot of potential for fascinating plot devices, and I think this story is a good example of this. It's set in a world in which people have the ability to create save points throughout their life. So you can think of this as something like saving your progress in a computer game. At any time, if you're not happy with the way your life is going, you can just go back in time to a save point that you created, and your life will begin again there as a fresh start. So everything that happened previously after that save point was created is erased and no longer exists. You can't jump forward in time, only backward to previous save points. So that's the basic premise. And this technology is overseen by a powerful organization known as Time Axis. So in this story, we follow a young man and the struggles that he is facing in his relationship with his wife, and the effect that this technology is having on their relationship. So, for instance, whenever they have a row and things get messy, he uses Time Axis to revert to a save point before the argument got going in order to do things differently, and so the row never happens. So rather than trying to solve his problems, it's easier for him to just make them disappear using this technology. It's a short tale, but I think in some ways it's quite a profound meditation on the human condition. Time Axis feeds on the natural human desire to achieve perfection. But the endless freedom and choice that this service offers is actually a bit of a curse. In using time travel to undo our mistakes, we forget that it's our flaws and our mistakes that are part of what makes us human. So I would recommend reading this as an absorbing, short time travel story with interesting themes. The next story I'd like to talk about is Arena by Fredric Brown. Fredric Brown was a master of creating outlandish and instantly engaging short stories with fantastic twist endings. And while he worked across a number of genres, Arena is probably his best known SF story. This one I discovered just last year in his collection, Honeymoon in Hell. Set against a backdrop of an intergalactic war with alien aggressors, this story is set in a mysterious cosmic battle arena that exists outside the normal dimensions of time and space. The protagonist, Carson, wakes up to find himself inside this arena, which is a large domed enclosure filled with blue sand. So it's quite a strange situation. He quickly discovers that he has been chosen as the representative of humanity to do battle with a single adversary within this arena who represents the enemy. So how these two beings ended up here, what is this place, and who is orchestrating this whole situation is a bit of a mystery. But what is made clear is that whoever wins this duel will decide the ultimate outcome of the whole war. And thus the fate of humanity hinges on it. So this is a classic piece of military science fiction, but it's also a really atmospheric and engaging suspense story. It's also got a really great payoff, and it's an absolute blast to read. Next, The Third Expedition by Ray Bradbury. So when I was putting this list together, I felt like it wouldn't be complete if I didn't include something from the Martian Chronicles. This is a classic fix-up novel, so the stories in here are all strung together and presented as episodes that chronicle humanity's attempts to colonize Mars. I really love this book. There's a lot of beautiful prose and evocative imagery in here, and it's become one of my all-time favourites within the genre. While it's got a number of memorable stories that come to mind, the one I'd like to mention is The Third Expedition, which was originally published in 1948 under the title Mars is Heaven. It's called The Third Expedition because this is humanity's third trip to Mars after the two previous ships were lost. This time round, the ship's crew arrive to find themselves in a Martian settlement that has an uncanny resemblance to their hometowns in 1920s America, in a way that is eerily familiar and yet idyllic and comforting. But stranger still, who do they find living there but their long-lost dead family and friends from their youth? What is going on? Have they travelled back in time? Are they in heaven? Or has something else happened? Give it a read and find out for yourself. It's a very haunting and memorable tale with a parable-like feel to it. I love this story. Okay, so we're down to the final three, and my next choice is The Very Slow Time Machine by Ian Watson. This is a real mind-bender of a story. I read it as the title story in this Ian Watson collection, The Very Slow Time Machine. And this has got one of the most intriguing time travel premises I've ever come across. So in this story, a time machine from the future appears out of nowhere in a science lab in 1985. And trapped inside the machine, there's an old man whom observers can see through a window from the outside and who appears to be insane. So it's a pretty bizarre scenario. But what's really astonishing, as we quickly discover, is that within the vessel, time is flowing backwards in real time. So that's to say, the old man inside experiences time in the opposite direction. So for every second that passes in our world, he grows 1 second younger. And this is a fixed pattern, and there's no escape from this. He's basically imprisoned within the machine, which is a completely self-sufficient life support chamber. And from this basic premise, we watch as his life unfolds in reverse inside the machine over the course of many years. It's a really remarkable concept and a thought-provoking tale with a very compelling mystery at the heart of the story that's brought to a very satisfying conclusion. So if you like ideas-focused sci-fi, especially of the mind-boggling sort, I can definitely recommend this story. At number 2, The Jaunt by Stephen King. This is a masterful sci-fi horror tale that you can find in the classic 1985 short story collection Skeleton Crew. One of the very few books that I have on e-reader. I hardly ever read ebooks these days, but this is how I read this one. This is a horror collection for the most part. There's some really great horror in here, but there is some science fiction too. And in my opinion, The Jaunt is the ultimate sci-fi horror story. This story takes place in a future in which teleportation technology has revolutionized the way we travel, and even allows people to travel to other planets. This is called jaunting. So in this story, we have a family who are about to take a trip to Mars via jaunting. While they are preparing for departure, the father tells his children the history of jaunting technology and how it came to be. And it's a pretty dark history. In typical King style, layers are built on the story, and the tension accumulates until we reach an extremely memorable and bone-chilling conclusion. I can't say anything more than that without risking heading into spoilers, so I think you really need to check this out for yourself. But I can definitely recommend this story. You will get sucked in when reading this. It's really well done. Along with The Mist and Survivor Type, which are also in this collection, it's among the most shocking and unforgettable horror stories that I've ever read. Classic Stephen King. And finally, at number 1, The Crime and the Glory of Commander Suzdal by Cordwainer Smith. A story that opens with this intriguing passage. Do not read this story. Turn the page quickly. The story may upset you. Anyhow, you probably know it already. It is a very disturbing story. Everyone knows it. The glory and the crime of Commander Suzdal have been told in 1,000 different ways. Don't let yourself realize that the story is the truth. It isn't. Not at all. There's not a bit of truth to it. There is no such planet as Aracosia, no such people as Klopts, no such world as Catland. These are all just imaginary. They didn't happen. Forget about it. Go away and read something else. Thus opens this amazing story. This is part of this collection, The Rediscovery of Man. I love this book so much. I'd say it's probably my all-time favourite short story collection that I've ever read. There are just so many gems in here. All of these stories are set within a bizarre future history that Smith created called The Instrumentality of Mankind, in which human civilization has expanded throughout space. People can live for hundreds of years thanks to longevity drugs, and animals are uplifted into intelligent humanoid forms. We've got lots of outlandish world building and compelling sci-fi ideas with colourful characters and far-fetched plots. All of these combine for some very entertaining stories, including what is perhaps Smith's most famous story, Scanners Live in Vain, which is an absolute masterpiece. So it was tempting to pick that one. However, the story I want to highlight today is The Crime and the Glory of Commander Suzdal. This is a decidedly weird tale. It concerns the commander of a generation ship, Commander Suzdal, who finds himself lured into a trap in space, set up by a monstrous race of beings known as the Klopts. These are all-male post-human descendants with a fascinating backstory, who are now hell-bent on destroying humanity. The commander is overwhelmed by enemy forces and has to make a quick decision on how to save his ship and his crew. And the choice that he makes is totally unpredictable and utterly shocking. And it's one of the most absurd plot devices I have ever come across. It involves cats. I can't say anything more than that, but it's very clever and quite bizarre. I get the impression that this author was a big cat lover, as they feature quite a lot in his stories. Anyway, it's a really great story. It's very strange, very otherworldly, and immensely entertaining. Maybe not the most highbrow piece of literature ever, but I really loved it, and that's why it's at the top of this list. So that completes the list. Thank you for watching. Feel free to share your thoughts on these stories in the comments, and I'll see you again soon.